The Thexmar Empire had elevated bureaucratic torture to an art form so refined, they'd actually created a department of procedural compliance optimization, which was itself managed by a subcommittee for administrative efficiency enhancement, which reported to a council for bureaucratic excellence evaluation. The fact that it took 17 different forms filled out in triplicate just to schedule a meeting to discuss scheduling meetings should have been a red flag that perhaps the galaxy's most administratively complex civilization had missed the point of government entirely. But nobody had been brave enough to suggest this to people who could weaponize paperwork. Director Inexville stood in his precisely organized office, surrounded by holographic displays showing processing queues, compliance metrics, and psychological breakdown statistics, with the satisfied air of someone who discovered that you could destroy souls using nothing more than proper procedures and systematically applied frustration. His chitinous carapace gleamed with the sort of professional polish that only came from decades of making other beings miserable through perfectly legal administrative channels. Subject 7241. He announced to his staff with the enthusiasm of someone unveiling a particularly promising quarterly report. Human female, designation Commander Ivy Sterling, captured during unauthorized reconnaissance in Thexmar territorial space. Initial psychological assessment indicates standard mammalian impatience patterns, with elevated stress responses to delayed gratification and procedural complexity. Deputy Administrator Kextrain consulted his datapad with the reverence of someone reading from the sacred texts of administrative excellence, which in Thexmar culture were actual sacred texts since they'd elevated bureaucracy to a religious calling. The preliminary behavioral analysis shows typical human emotional volatility, Director. Shortened attention spans, primitive linear thinking patterns, and that peculiar tendency toward impatience that makes extended procedural delays so effective against their species. Through the reinforced observation portal, Commander Ivy Sterling sat in the processing center's waiting area with the relaxed posture of someone who'd mastered the art of productive waiting, rather than someone about to experience the galaxy's most sophisticated administrative torture. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and she wore the standard processing jumpsuit with the casual comfort of someone who'd worn worse outfits to client meetings. Most disturbing of all, she was examining the facility's organizational charts posted on the walls with the focused attention of a consultant evaluating operational efficiency. Interesting hierarchical structure, she murmured, tracing workflow patterns with her finger. 7 layers of management oversight for basic prisoner processing, with redundant approval chains and what appears to be deliberately designed bottlenecks. She paused, studying the departmental interaction flowchart. This is either masterful systems design for maximum inefficiency, or someone's been building processes without considering operational throughput. Nexvel's mandibles clicked in what might have been concern, though with Thexmar facial expressions it could have been indigestion, satisfaction, or a mild allergic reaction to excellence. The subject appears to be analyzing our administrative infrastructure rather than experiencing appropriate pre-processing anxiety. Standard deflection behavior, Kextrain assured him. The primitive mind's attempt to focus on familiar concepts to avoid confronting impending procedural trauma. The compliance processing system will correct this shortly. Ah yes, the compliance processing system, Nexvel's masterpiece and the crown jewel of Thexmar administrative science. Unlike crude physical torture, the system attacked the will to live through carefully calibrated bureaucratic procedures, administrative delays, and systematic frustration that increased exponentially until the subject's spirit simply gave up trying to navigate the maze of requirements and surrendered all information just to make the paperwork stop. It was elegant, legal, and had a 100% success rate across 1,247 different species who'd all eventually broken down sobbing and begging to just fill out whatever forms would end their ordeal. The processing center itself resembled a corporate office designed by someone who'd read about corporate offices in a fever dream, then tried to recreate the experience using only the most soul-crushing elements of administrative procedure. Endless corridors, lined with waiting areas led to processing stations, where subjects faced increasingly complex requirements administered by staff who'd been trained to be politely unhelpful in exactly the right way to maximize psychological pressure. Transfer the subject to Processing Station Alpha. Nixville commanded with the authority of someone who'd turned making people wait into a science. Standard protocol: begin with basic information gathering, then proceed through escalating procedural complexity until psychological architecture collapses under administrative pressure. Ivy was escorted to the processing station with the clinical politeness that the Thexmar applied to everything, which meant she was guided by helpful signs and automated directions rather than actually assisted, because personal service was considered inefficient when properly designed systems could handle routine tasks. She settled into the processing chair with the interested attention of a consultant beginning a new client assessment. "Welcome to the Thexmar Compliance Processing Center," announced the automated system with the cheerful efficiency of a particularly sadistic customer service interface. "To ensure proper processing of your detention requirements, please complete Forms 1A through 47J, available at the dispensing unit to your left. Please note that all forms must be completed in chronological order, signed in the presence of a certified witness, and submitted in triplicate with appropriate supporting documentation. 47 forms for initial processing," Ivy noted with professional interest. "That's actually impressive from a complexity management perspective. How do you handle the processing bottlenecks when multiple subjects need simultaneous certification?" And Nixville activated the communication system with the flourish of administrative authority backed by properly filed paperwork. "Commander Sterling, you are now subject to Thexmar Administrative Compliance Protocol 7. This system will systematically process your detention requirements until you provide the intelligence we require regarding human military installations and defensive capabilities." "Got it," Ivy nodded agreeably, already examining the first form with the focused attention of someone reviewing a contract. "Quick question: do I need to complete the witness certification requirements before or after the supporting documentation review? Because Form 12C references a validation process that isn't defined until Form 23F, but Form 8B requires the validation to be complete before proceeding." Kextrain looked puzzled. "Is she reviewing our procedural documentation for logical consistency?" "Phase 1, Nexville declared, deciding to ignore the human's bizarre analytical approach. Basic information processing with standard administrative delays. The processing center's systems activated with the smooth efficiency of a bureaucracy designed by people who understood that the most effective torture wasn't inflicting pain. It was wasting time in ways that made the victim complicit in their own frustration. Forms required information that could only be obtained by completing other forms. Approval processes required approval from departments that were only open during specific hours that conflicted with other required appointments. Simple requests triggered cascading requirements for documentation that didn't exist or could only be obtained from offices located in different facilities. Most subjects began showing signs of psychological stress within hours as they realized they were trapped in an infinite loop of administrative requirements designed to make progress impossible while making the victim feel like failure was their own fault for not understanding the system properly. Ivy approached the challenge with the systematic methodology of someone who'd spent years optimizing corporate workflows for maximum efficiency. She created flowcharts on the margins of forms, mapped procedural dependencies, and began identifying critical path bottlenecks with the enthusiasm of a consultant who'd found a particularly interesting optimization problem. "This is actually brilliant," she said after 2 hours of form completion. "You've created a recursive dependency system where each requirement generates additional requirements exponentially. The psychological pressure comes from the subject's own desire for completion, conflicting with systematically impossible fulfillment criteria." She paused to examine a particularly complex approval chain that required signatures from 7 different departments, 3 of which were mutually exclusive in their operating procedures. "Though I'm seeing some inefficiencies in your process design, Form 31B requires validation from the authentication department, but authentication can't process requests without pre-approval from verification, which doesn't accept requests without completion of Form 31B. That's going to create deadlock conditions that prevent processing entirely. She's debugging our administrative torture system, Checkstrain whispered, his mandibles displaying patterns that indicated a level of horror typically reserved for natural disasters or tax audits. Phase 2, HFY announced through clenched mandibles, or whatever the Thexmar equivalent of clenched mandibles was. Procedural Humiliation Protocol. The system escalated to actively hostile administration designed to strip dignity through systematic belittlement disguised as helpful procedure. Requirements became contradictory. Staff members provided incorrect information with perfect politeness. Completed forms were rejected for trivial formatting errors that had to be discovered through trial and error. The goal was to convince the subject that they were fundamentally inadequate to meet even basic administrative requirements, creating learned helplessness that would eventually break their will to resist. Ivy treated the escalation as a fascinating case study in organizational dysfunction. The contradictory requirements pattern is interesting, she observed, reviewing a form that simultaneously required information to be provided and omitted. You're using cognitive dissonance to create frustration, but you're also accidentally revealing the underlying logical structure of your system. She began taking notes on the back of discarded forms, creating what looked suspiciously like a comprehensive organizational analysis. The staff training is excellent. They're providing precisely unhelpful assistance in ways that maintain plausible deniability while maximizing subject frustration. That takes serious management oversight to implement consistently. After 6 hours of escalating administrative harassment, she looked up from her improvised workflow diagram. I think I'm beginning to understand your operational model. This isn't actually designed to process anything efficiently, it's designed to create controlled failure states that generate predictable psychological responses. She's reverse engineering our entire administrative philosophy. Checkstrain reported, his bioluminescent patterns now indicating the sort of panic typically associated with budget shortfalls or performance reviews. Phase 3. HFY snarled through his communication system. Maximum procedural complexity. All administrative pressure protocols. The processing center unleashed its full bureaucratic arsenal. Forms required information that contradicted other required information. Approval chains became circular references that led back to themselves. Deadlines were set for tasks that required completion of other tasks that couldn't be started until after the original deadline. The system became a maze of administrative impossibility designed to convince subjects that reality itself was unreliable and that their only escape was to surrender all resistance to the obviously superior Thexmar administrative system. Ivy stood up and began walking around the processing station with the focused attention of someone conducting a comprehensive systems audit. She was mapping information flows, identifying decision points, and analyzing the recursive structures that made the system self-perpetuating. This is actually fascinating, she said, somehow maintaining conversational tone despite being surrounded by the full fury of weaponized bureaucracy. You've created a procedural system that's designed to fail, but the failure modes are carefully controlled to maintain the appearance of legitimacy while generating maximum psychological pressure. She paused at what appeared to be a routine filing cabinet, but was actually a critical component of the facility's administrative processing network. But here's the thing about complex systems, she continued, opening drawers and examining their contents with professional interest. The more complex they become, the more vulnerable they are to systematic failure. Warning indicators began flashing throughout the processing center. See, I spent 8 years as a corporate efficiency consultant before I joined the military, Ivy explained, methodically examining form processing workflows and approval routing systems. I specialized in identifying and eliminating administrative bottlenecks in large organizations. She found a critical processing queue and began completing forms in a specific sequence that seemed random but was actually precisely calculated. Complex bureaucratic systems like this one depend on controlled failure to maintain psychological pressure. But if you understand the underlying logic, you can turn controlled failure into uncontrolled success. Stop her! Nexvel screamed, but his perfect administrative torture system was already revealing the fundamental flaw in its design. Ivy had spent hours learning every aspect of the processing center's procedures while pretending to be its victim. Her background in systems optimization had taught her to recognize the structural dependencies that held complex administrative systems together, and her experience with corporate bureaucracy had given her an intuitive understanding of how procedural systems could be exploited by someone who understood their underlying logic. The processing center wasn't just an administrative nightmare, it was a carefully balanced system of interdependent procedures that required precise calibration to maintain controlled dysfunction. And like any precisely balanced system, it was vulnerable to someone who understood how to create strategic successes that would cascade through the entire network. The problem with building a system designed to fail in controlled ways, Ivy said, completing a series of forms in exactly the right sequence to trigger recursive approval loops, is that success becomes a system-breaking exception condition. She submitted the final form in the sequence, and the processing center's sophisticated administrative systems discovered that someone had just successfully completed every requirement in their database simultaneously, creating approval cascades that the system wasn't designed to handle. The center didn't just malfunction, it experienced what could technically be called a bureaucratic cascade failure, and more accurately described as the administrative equivalent of dividing by zero. Approval systems began approving everything automatically. Processing queues cleared themselves instantly. Form requirements began generating negative values, which caused the system to start issuing refunds for services that had never been charged for. Administrative locks throughout the facility opened as the system, unable to maintain controlled failure conditions, defaulted to unconditional success states. Thousands of prisoners found themselves automatically processed for immediate release as the computers, faced with impossible procedural success, decided that everyone must have completed all requirements perfectly. Ivy walked out of the processing center, covered in automatically generated completion certificates and looking mildly satisfied. "Not bad," she said, reviewing a certificate that apparently qualified her as a licensed administrative excellence specialist, though the system architecture could use some optimization for maintainability. Behind her, the most sophisticated administrative torture facility in galactic history was discovering that when you build a system designed to break spirits through procedural failure, and someone successfully completes all your procedures at once, the results tend to be both ironic and systematically catastrophic. Major Blake Patterson, another human prisoner who'd been scheduled for his own processing session, found Ivy in the facility's main corridor, surrounded by automatically released prisoners from dozens of species. "Commander Sterling, how did you? Turns out their torture system has the same vulnerabilities as any other over-engineered bureaucracy," she replied, dodging a shower of automatically printed success certificates that the system was apparently issuing to everyone retroactively. "Plus, I haven't had a decent process optimization challenge in years." She paused to wave at the flat observation deck where Nxvel stood frozen in administrative shock, watching his life's work collapse into a procedural success spiral. "Thanks for the consulting opportunity, Director. Though you might want to consider simplifying your workflow dependencies." The final reports would note that Ivy Sterling's processing resulted in the automatic release of 3,847 prisoners, the complete systemic failure of the Thexmar administrative network, and the psychological collapse of Director Nxvel, who spent the remainder of his career in therapy, trying to understand how his perfect torture system had been defeated by someone who treated bureaucratic harassment as a management consulting project. The compliance processing system was permanently retired after the incident. Thexmar administrative scientists published several papers analyzing what they termed the Sterling paradox, the discovery that humans responded to increasing administrative pressure by becoming more systematically analytical, rather than more psychologically vulnerable. Ivy was eventually returned to human space through a prisoner exchange that was processed in record time due to the Thexmar's sudden enthusiasm for administrative simplification. The lesson learned by the galactic community was clear. Humans didn't break under administrative pressure. They optimized it until it broke itself. As for Ivy, she returned to duty with a commendation and several offers from major corporations who'd heard about her innovative approach to bureaucratic problem-solving. When interviewed about her experience, she typically responded with characteristic professionalism, interesting organizational challenge, excellent case study in systemic dysfunction. The procedural complexity was impressive, but the process architecture was clearly designed without consideration for edge case handling. 3 stars for ambition, 1 star for implementation. The Thexmar Empire, meanwhile, abandoned administrative torture entirely and adopted a simplified government structure based on the radical concept of making administrative processes actually work efficiently, which proved far more effective than their previous methods, though considerably less dramatic. And somewhere in the depths of bureaucratic space, former director in Nexville continued his rehabilitation sessions, trying to explain to increasingly confused therapists that he hadn't been defeated by superior administration, overwhelming paperwork, or brilliant bureaucratic maneuvering, but by meeting someone who had treated his life's work as what she described as a moderately interesting process optimization project with room for improvement. The universe, it seemed, maintained an excellent sense of irony and a complete disrespect for those who believed they understood the true power of proper paperwork.